Welcome, welcome, welcome. You are listening to, you are watching, you are witnessing Humanity in the Headlines. I am your host, Atiba Buchanan. Joining me as always, my co-pilot, my co-host and friend, Mr. David Seaton. How you doing, sir?
Just jamming to that smooth jazz
every week, right?
Mr. Winfrey just let us.
He brings it every week. So at the top of the show, before we forget, we know, I just want to extend a happy birthday to Mr. Winfrey.
Mr. Earl Winfrey, yes. Happy birthday.
Yes, he is the creator of this platform, IntellectualRadio-Podcast. And we thank him for what he does for us and our community and allowing us to get our voices heard. So we just want to wish him a happy birthday. Enjoy your day, man. Thank you so much. So, Dave, we got a lot to talk about this week. Let me tell you, Facebook people, Intellectual Radio people, YouTube people, we have a lot to talk about today. Time management is paramount. So we're just going to hop right to it. We've got, let's tease them a little bit, Dave. We've got at the top of the hour, we've got Reverend Derek McCoy from CURE, the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. They are a organization that is basically a Black organization of evangelical leaders that support the president, and they're supporting him even after his comments on Tuesday concerning Charlottesville. And we want to ask him why. How does he continue to justify that support? We're definitely going to let him have his say, and but he will definitely be challenged here today, in so much as being able to articulate that, and maybe we'll walk away with a different understanding. Who knows? But that's going to be an amazing conversation.
That would be interesting.
But it's going to be an amazing conversation, and we are thankful for them coming on today. In the middle of the show, you don't want to miss that because you want to be here the whole hour. Later in the show, we're going to be talking to Dr. Jane Daly from University of Chicago. She's a professor of history, and she's going to walk us through kind of the historical context of Confederate statues. Are they history, heritage, or hoax? And she's going to be our guest for that today. She wrote an incredible piece for HuffPost.com the other day. And closing out the show, we're going to speak with Professor Jennifer Lowenstein from Penn State University. She's a Middle East lecturer, and she is going to articulate the relationship now between Donald Trump and the Jewish community, given that our president found it necessary to side with, to support Nazis. So neo-Nazis. Thank you so much. So what does the Jewish community think about that, given that he has a Jewish son-in-law as well? So I know there's some nuance to that perhaps we're missing, but we're definitely going to break it down today. So we're looking forward to all of those conversations. You don't want to miss it. We don't have a whole lot of time. David, your thoughts on just, off top.
Definitely looking forward to having this conversation with the pastor. I always love talking to Black pastors and listening to them try to reconcile their ideology and their biblical support with people who are, well, in this case, someone who is obviously secular and,
right,
is the antithesis of everything that the Bible espouses and suggests that we should be. So do us a favor. This first conversation, like I said, I anticipate this first conversation is going to be hot. So on Facebook Live, go ahead and share this on your page. We want to make sure as many people witness this conversation as possible. You and I follow the news all week, and we get in preparation for this show and just in general. But a lot of people don't have the time necessarily to watch the news every day and read and get informed and stay current on what's going on. So that's what we like to do here.
Great. So we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will be joined by Reverend Derek McCoy of CURE. Thank you so much for watching Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back with you. Thank you for sticking with us, everyone. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, I'm your host, Atiba Buchanan, joined by Mr. David Seaton. And today we are discussing Donald Trump amidst the events last week in Charlottesville, which happened 1 week ago today, after his subsequent comments on the event on that Sunday, Monday, and then Tuesday. And joining us today is the Reverend Derek McCoy from the Center of Urban Renewal and Education, CURE. He is the Executive Vice President. Thank you, Mr. McCoy, for joining us. How are you today, sir? Oh, we are excellent. It's wonderful weather here in Chicago. It's a beautiful day. And our listeners are very eager to hear your perspective today. So we're just going to hop right into it because time is against us. So basically, I had come across a piece that basically explained that pastors, and I'm sure there are many that have supported Donald Trump as a candidate, as the president, and even after these events in Charlottesville, and more importantly, his response. They say life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you deal with it. And it's the dealing with it that a lot of people have taken exception to. And I would like to know, as a Trump supporter and as a member of the cloth, how is it that you're able to reconcile your support of him given his positions?
As a member of the cloth, as a Trump supporter is a whole nother issue. I think as a member of the cloth and where I'm at personally is I'm wholeheartedly at a place. I have another person from your place calling me on the same line, so I don't know if that was you purposely.
No, it's not us.
Okay, no problem. Sorry about that. But we came out with the pre-intended press conference way before any of the Charlottesville items had erupted. We had some scholars amongst us. We also had other members of the cloth in terms of clergy. And really, our purpose was to, hey, look, there's a lot of drama going on, a lot of things being said. We want to be able to support what we can support and really move the ball forward for our urban communities with real issues that are happening. And that's kind of where we were coming from. The Charlottesville events took place a couple of days prior to. We said we would still address those issues. When asked the question personally about, should all the blame be on Donald Trump, I said, no, I don't think so. Donald Trump, I think, we, especially in the African-American community, I'm trying to figure out, when do we start electing some high holy official? That hasn't been the case. And so when we're looking at a guy who has had a history of putting up properties, gambling facilities, and everything else, I don't really hold him to some high in terms of some moral code value. I look at it as he's the president, he's in place. We need to respect anybody who's in that office, period. And so what can we do to try and accomplish some objectives that's going to best serve our community? You don't sit it out for 4 years and hope the best. I don't think that's the smartest move on anybody's term. So I wouldn't have done that on the last president, and I wouldn't do it on this one.
This is David Seaton, and we really appreciate you coming on today. I'm listening to what you're saying, and certainly there is some merit to trying to access the levers of power through the individual who is sitting in the presidency. I'm curious, though. Again, you mentioned that this is a guy who's built casinos and he's built buildings, and he certainly made the majority of his money licensing his name to those buildings. But what have you seen becoming the president, and certainly since then, that would give you any hope that he would actually do something tangible?
Okay, that's a great question. I think he's one of the guys that have actually put it up and said things repeatedly over and over again about trying to help fix our inner city. Now, whether that's all the way 100% true or whether that's 100% purpose of what he's trying to do, I really couldn't tell you. Only thing I can say is he's made the effort and the attempts, and he's made statements several times. One of the things that I saw happening over the last several weeks has been a drowning out of that effort. And, while dealing with all these other issues, which everybody knows, we got North Korea issues, we got Russia issues, we got a lot of issues happening, besides the political issues and besides I call it the verbiage missteps of Donald Trump on a regular basis that happens, because I could never tell you what he's going to say. But the other side is he's made efforts before he got elected, when he was at the inauguration, and after the inauguration, about trying to help fix our inner cities. Now,
stop right there. That's what I'm asking you. Maybe because maybe we're ignorant, and we certainly want to make sure our listeners are brought up to speed. What has Donald Trump done other than tweet and talk about fixing the inner city, which I would put out there? I would say that Donald Trump used that as a campaign issue to try and get black votes and to try and get people who were sitting on the fence to say, oh, he can't be that bad. He wants to help the inner city. And you keep saying these things that he has done. What has he done?
Yeah. No. Let's go back to what you just said. I agree. He was a politician running a candidacy trying to get people to vote for him and elect him. I think he did use it that way. Now, that being said, and that's on the table, that's not a secret. Every single politician that runs presidency on either side of the aisle do that to all of us. We have people that come to our pulpits every single week before election to try to say, hey, look, let's sway the election. Let's talk to them and say, what are you going to get done? We got people that have been serving in Congress, even in our Congressional Black Caucus, that has passed only one bill in their entire time that they've been in office. So it's an interesting anomaly with President Trump. I don't think he's done much at all right now. What I think is he's been in office 7 months, or we count 8, I guess. 8 months. And he's mentioned this several times. The reason, like I said, we came to a press conference before is, hey, don't forget you said this. This is important value to us. We want to make sure you pay attention to it and do something. Don't just sit there and tweet. Don't just sit there and placate the African American community or other communities and the urban communities, period. But do something about it. Develop an agenda. And I do know that there are people that were in various places of the administration, but I think it's getting lost, to be honest. And this is the piece that I look at is we have to do something, and we have to make our voice heard as often as we can and as best we can. Unfortunately, the tragedy of Charlottesville, I think, has just continued to unearth the racial disruption that's been going on in our communities for quite some time. That's a whole nother issue. But I think, with Donald Trump, I'm not here to, you will not hear from me somebody who's going to stand up and say Donald Trump is the greatest thing since sliced bread and we should all be about Donald Trump. No, we should hold him accountable as the president and say, this is what you said, get on your job and get it done. Do something.
Okay, so with that said, and you bringing it back to Charlottesville, which is what I wanted to do, this is Atiba, and I thank you for doing that. So my question to you is, after the events of Charlottesville, we had white supremacists marching the streets saying, you will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Blood and soil. After you see these very diabolical things being said, and you see the violence that ensued afterwards, someone losing their life, dozens being injured from this guy running them over with a car. And again, Trump didn't do that. We are not here to say that. But after seeing his response, where he puts equal blame on what he calls both sides,
many sides.
Yeah, on many sides. And so my question to you is, after seeing his response, were you satisfied with that response, and why?
Was I satisfied with the response? I'll say this. Made a response, and he talked about, he did denounce racism. He did denounce some of those aspects. And he also did say something to the effect of, both sides having an issue. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I first heard it, it gave a recoil, because I look at the people that are marching in the street and I say, I don't like that. I don't like what they're doing. I don't like, that's personally. At the same time, his response, and I thought about something my parents told me a long time ago, it takes two to tango. And I began to reflect, and I said, you know what, for the last couple of years, we've been pushing Black Lives Matter, or, not we, but I mean, the general concept of our culture and our society. There's been a lot of racial unrest that has been going on, and they have been talking about these things for quite some time. The reason why I think we should be thinking about this in terms of why are they coming out? Why are they now marching in the streets? Well, to be honest, I think it's like the guys that have been on the street. We've been talking to these guys over and over again, and they're coming back out to say something. Now, do I like that? Absolutely not. Am I going to stand up against them? Oh, sure I am. But at the same time, the two sides aspect of it, yeah, there is a little bit of unrest on both ends of it, because I do think that there are people that are just, these guys are pushing and they're tired of it, and these guys going to push back and they're tired of it. So it's one of those things that we're watching in our society. And I think these real intense issues evolve, circulate, and everything else, that we got to be able to look at them and say, how do you solve these issues? These are hard issues in our country. But I don't think on the sidelines and just throwing fodder at one side is going to be the thing that gets it off. And I think Donald Trump, I think J.C. Watt said it well. He is missing the magnitude of the presidency. What this means when he makes a statement or addresses an issue. I think he does, because I think, the days following, he just doubled down, and the way he said it, it's like, my mama used to say this. It ain't so much what you say, it's how you say it. And it's really important that how we say stuff and how he says stuff as a president. He's going to either have to learn it, or he's going to really have some hard knocks going down his way. It's the last 8 months. And I don't know if he's going to have a better path before him if he doesn't change. But I do look at it as they're not good statements. They're not supportive of our communities. But I do think there's truth to what he says. Sift all criticism for truth. And if we look to do that in our personal lives and in the things that we do, I think we can learn a lot sometimes by just looking at how we look at things and how we can sift it for truth. And
this is David again. And again, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I don't want to be pugnacious, but I definitely want to push back and play devil's advocate. Let's not talk about the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. Let's talk about the original Nazis of the 1940s under Adolf Hitler's Germany. I've never heard anyone, when they are talking about history, say, well, there was evil on both sides. Hitler was doing stuff, but then, the Allied forces went in there and they fought with Hitler. So, I mean, if they would have stayed out of there, I mean, there was blame on both sides. When we look at history, and when we look at history through the prism of morality, we decide, and you know this as a minister, we decide and we look at the two sides and we say one side is immoral and the other side, because they are pushing against immorality based on having a superior moral position, we don't then lump those two groups together. We make a distinction between the morality of what motivates people to do the things that they do. Now let's fast forward to Charlottesville, and we're talking about neo-Nazis. I'm trying to understand, and again, maybe I'm missing you, but I'm trying to understand your line of thought when you are subscribing to what the president said when he says that there's blame on both sides. Again, you have neo-Nazis Nazis who were going out there holding up tiki torches and making these statements, Jews will not replace us. And these people, they had to stay inside of their church because they were afraid to come out. And then you had another group of people that were saying, no, these people are immoral. These people lack the moral authority to do what they're doing. So we are going to march against them. In that situation, some conflict ensued because you had people on different sides of the morality of the issue. How do you then lump? I would no more lump those people together than I would lump in the United States and Hitler's Germany in the 1940s. Tell me where I'm wrong.
I think you're wrong. I don't think you're wrong, but I think if we turn this back to and I agree. I mean, when you deal with the neo-Nazis, you deal with the history. I agree. You wouldn't want, and that's you even mentioned that because you don't want the Hitler statue standing up in the middle of Israel and saying, "Hey, this is a great thing." I agree, but I think the other side is you're saying I subscribe to everything he said, and that's not necessarily the case. What I said is let's sift what he said for truth. And say, is there things that are valid on both sides of the issue that may be there? Now, because I do believe we have had unrest in the last few years in our country. And that has been, what's that?
We haven't said anything. We're listening to you, sir.
I can't really hear you.
No, go ahead and finish your point.
Yeah, we were listening to you. Go ahead.
Okay, no problem. And I'm just saying we've had unrest in our country and we've had turmoil that's been happening. And it's all been out of some of that seed of racism. Now, I don't agree with when you have neo-Nazi statements, and those guys marching down the street, you got KKK marching down the street. Back to the history of that and say there was immorality there. They twisted scripture. They were not right. They hung people on that line. And that's not a thing that we want to stand for.
Well, you know what?
In America, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying we're going to bring this segment to a close because we got a packed show today. But we appreciate you coming on. Tell our visitors, or tell our listeners and our watchers really quickly how they can follow Cure and where they can find you online.
Sure, no problem. You can find us online, urbancure.org, urbancure.org, or 202-479-CURE. We're located in D.C., and we try to work on issues that are affecting our urban culture.
All right.
And we thank you for your work, by the way.
Right. Reverend Derek McCoy, we are definitely going to have you back because we need to have this conversation, I think, a little bit more in depth. And we apologize for the shortness of the segment, but we definitely thank you for being on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Time is against us, man. We need more time. What can we do?
That one we could have done for a whole hour, if not more.
I mean, I had like 5 questions in my head. I wanted to ask them, do you support Black Lives Matter?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, are you equivocating Black Lives Matter to the KKK?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to kind of get a baseline feeling on those things to understand.
And he kind of intimated that.
Right, he did.
He kind of intimated.
So I just wanted to ask him directly. So that we don't have more time. But again, hot show, we got more and more coming for you. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to discuss Confederate statues. Are they history, heritage, or hoax? You don't want to miss that on Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, this is Atiba Buchanan. If you're just joining us, my co-host with me today, as always, is Mr. David Seaton on IntellectualRadio.com. Again, we thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed that last section or that last segment with Reverend Derek McCoy from Cure as we discussed their support of the president even after the events of Charlottesville. We definitely have to have him back for part 2. Continuing the theme, we have a lot of things to talk about concerning Charlottesville and the events that ensued. The main thing that it was supposed to be about, Dave, was the statue of Robert E. Lee. and these people supporting it, not wanting it taken down. And we have over 700 statues of Confederate figures across the country.
Right.
Most of which were built in the 20th century, in the 1900s, years after the Civil War,
Right.
During the advent of Jim Crow. And I'm not going to steal the thunder of our next guest. I'm just trying to set it up a little bit for our listeners. But it got me to thinking. People very impassionately say that this is about culture, this is about history,
Right.
and this is about heritage. And I'm trying to be open-minded to their perspective. I'm not from the South. I was born in Chicago. I've been to Atlanta twice. So, again, I know things are different down there. So I can't speak
Very much so.
I can't speak to their culture. So I'm trying to be open-minded about this. But to me, it just seems like a hoax. It seems like an opportunity to suppress a people, an opportunity to remind them of a different era, of a different time, and to remind them that we could go back to that time. Don't ever get too comfortable. That's what, when I see a Confederate flag, when I see these figures, that's the message that I'm being told. Your thoughts?
And I'd love to hear the doctor comment on this. There's definitely something about iconography. When you create an icon, or even if you're talking about just basic marketing and you create a logo, you're trying to elicit a certain feeling or a certain thought.
Association.
You're trying to create an association between that actual logo and an experience. And when you're talking about Confederate monuments that have been that are remnants of individuals who committed treason in the grand scheme of things, and they lost. I don't know of any other country in the world where the losing side of a civil war has monuments to the architects of their side that last 150 years later.
Absolutely. So helping us to unpack this, and definitely for the benefit of our listeners, we have joining us today Dr. Jane Daly, Associate Professor of American History at the University of Chicago. How are you this afternoon, ma'am?
Oh, I'm great. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. We thank you so much for joining us today. I had come across your piece written for HuffPost, where the piece titled "Baltimore's Confederate Monument Was Never About History and Culture." If you could talk about the motivation for writing that piece and kind of give our listeners a historical context, if you could kind of paint the scene as to what we didn't understand about 1948 when the statue went up.
Right. Well, I was really struck when I was reading the news story that morning about the different monuments, and that Baltimore's was put up in 1948, which is really late for a Confederate monument, right? You pointed out quite rightly that most of the monuments were erected around the turn of the century, maybe a little bit later, and sometimes people sponsored them, but it took a long time to raise the money. So that's the case in the Baltimore statue. It was originally, I think there was a bequest from a childless millionaire who left $100,000, which was a lot of money, in 1928, which was when he left it, to build a monument to Robert E. Lee. But it took a while. The war intervened. But I was really struck by it being erected in 1948 because of that moment in my op-ed, which was this immediate post-war moment, which was in the South incredibly violent along racial lines in particular, with African-American veterans coming home and being deployed and being lynched for wearing the uniform of the United States, for example. That's the context for 1948. 1948 is a moment when President Truman has finally, on his executive authority, desegregated the armed forces of the United States. And I was so pleased to see earlier this week the different statements by branches of the armed forces, which are the most integrated institutions in the United States. And it was really, I found it very, very happy to see them stand up and say, we are not standing for bigotry or white supremacy.
And this is David, Doctor. Thank you for being on with us today. Again, I was kind of leading in with just talking about symbols and icons and how the purpose of those symbols and icons is to create a connection to an experience. When you're talking about people who are erecting monuments, they're trying to preserve a part of history. And really, that history is one of treasonous Confederates that were trying to secede from the United States. Am I missing something there?
Well, actually, I think it's even more complicated than that. I don't think they're trying to preserve history. They're making an argument in the present. And that's where it gets really complicated with these monuments, because Robert E. Lee, okay, the war's over, but why erect a statue of Robert E. Lee in 1948? Right? It's that kind of moment where you think, well, we must not really be talking about Robert E. Lee. We must not really be talking about the Civil War, and especially in a state like Maryland, which was a border state and did not participate as a state in the Civil War, even though lots of individual Marylanders did indeed fight and die in the Civil War. The state itself sat it out. So again, you have to ask, this can't just be about Robert E. Lee.
And again, when I listen to you make that point, as a professor of history, it sounds like to me that the real issue is that the vast majority of Americans are ignorant of history.
I think that's an uncharitable way of putting it. I think when it comes to the history of the period after the Civil War, it's not so much that Americans are uneducated as that they've been indoctrinated by white Southerners who wrote the history after the Civil War. And it's not a coincidence that the same elite women who sponsored the Confederate monument building boom across the South also creation of the first textbooks in American history used in the region's public schools. And they made very sure to make sure that the story that was told there was one of Confederate valor. African-American enfranchisement was a catastrophe. The war destroyed the Southern economy, et cetera, et cetera.
And I guess that kind of goes to my point that you're saying that the losers in the Civil War were the ones who wrote the original textbooks, which by its very nature, they had to be flawed. They had to be colored to a perspective of someone from the South. So if you have generation after generation subsequent to the Civil War who were, to use your word, indoctrinated with a history that was factually incorrect, then how could you possibly have it? Then you would obviously look at a monument of General Robert Lee, and it would fill you with pride because you've been hearing this story of this great tactician, this great general from the Civil War.
And he was a great tactician. He was also responsible for the deaths of more American citizens in our country's history.
Exactly.
So this is a T. I'd like to jump in if possible. My concern here with the statues and hearing you speak today is that, and it goes back to David's point, I really feel like that racism today is a lot of it is rooted in our educational system. We have, to your point, Doctor, we have textbooks in Texas now where they're trying to call slaves immigrant workers. And so when you have that, again, when people grow up with that, because the people that respect these statues and respect the Confederate flag do so in a very impassioned way. And I would agree with you that indoctrinated is not too strong a word. What is it we can do with our educational system that allows people to grow up and understand the true history? Not that all white people are bad. That isn't the point at all. The point is to say that this country belongs to everyone, and how can we get that in our educational system so that people grow up and appreciate the contributions of everyone that made this country the great thing that it is today?
That's a really great point. There are a couple of things we can do. I think former Justice of the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, has been working for many years now to try to get civics back into our schools. I think probably all of us learn civics, how to get how a bill becomes a law, all of that stuff. That's not taught very much in American schools anymore. American history isn't taught very much in American schools. I'll make a little plug here that one way we can get people back into a different narrative is by reading American history. And the University of Chicago Press is going to publish a 2-volume history of the United States that is going to be online for free.
That's
wow.
That's great.
That is excellent.
That is great. You were go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one thing is getting access to people. I think We've seen the way that the hate groups have used the internet to organize themselves and to spread their information, much further than in the past, and that we all need to use the electronic resources available to us also to try to get readers and listeners.
So go ahead, Dave.
No, and I was just going to say it's interesting that you use the word hate groups, because I think that's the other part of it. When you start talking about low information people or people who are receiving misinformation, there are a lot of people out. You and the three of us would certainly agree that neo-Nazis and KKK and white supremacists, we would all agree that those are hate groups. But the individuals who are being recruited into those groups are being recruited under the guise that this is some sort of white pride or preservation of white culture. And until we can get to a uniform definition of what a hate group is, we're going to continue to have these issues, aren't we?
I think that we will, and I think you're right. Nobody signs up for a hate group.
Right.
Right. They sign up for something else.
Right.
Well, I'd like to quote a piece from the article you wrote, because it goes along with what we're talking about. You say in May 1947, President Truman announced a traveling exhibit of America's key democratic documents, including original copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation. You say, interestingly, the constitutional amendments that put life into the Emancipation Proclamation were considered too provocative to be included, but that's okay. Dubbed the Freedom Train, you go on to say, the red, white, and blue streamliner visited each of the 47 contiguous states. Towns and cities were encouraged to hold rededication weeks to coincide with the arrival of the traveling exhibit, in which citizens would pledge to uphold the democratic principles of the nation. Drawing conflict out in the open, the Freedom Train forbade segregated viewing of the exhibit. Memphis and Birmingham let it pass them by. But that idea of the Freedom Train, if you could expound on that a little bit.
So the Freedom Train is sponsored really by two things. One is it's a piece of anti-communist theater. It's sending around our documents. You have to remember that, poor Harry Truman, 1948 was also the beginning, really, of the Cold War. And so one thing that was happening in the United States is the Soviet Union was pummeling the U.S. every single day in their newspapers, in the United Nations, with stories about racist violence in the United States, saying, this isn't a democracy. How can this be a democracy? Or if it is a democracy, it's not something we want to be part of. So the idea of the Freedom Train, in part, was to do this big demonstration of, the glories of our democracy, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, Lincoln. So that was one big aim of it. But the other one, especially in the South, was to try to remind Southerners, white Southerners, of what I think they would say their heritage, right? Their constitutional heritage, the Declaration of Independence, and their obligations to, their mutual obligations to their citizens and their states and their country. So it really served a twofold purpose.
Something like that would be beneficial today, because I'm looking at a President Truman in 1948 and during almost what would be considered the height of Jim Crow. And here we are, fast forward to 2017, and our president, when you compare and contrast President Truman's efforts to bring the nation together, compare that to Donald Trump's divisiveness, what does that say about where we are today? And do you think, again, something like a Freedom Train, an exhibit like that would be beneficial?
I think it doesn't say good things about where we are today. And I do think the idea of a Freedom Train, I was a little bit tongue-in-cheek there, but the response I've gotten to that was, yeah, that would be great. And inspiring about seeing the original documents. And the documents that are founding to ourselves as a union, I think, are particularly important. I know that a few years ago, there was a traveling exhibit of the Gettysburg Address and the different drafts of it, and it was extraordinarily moving to see the handwritten drafts of that and the pencil corrections. And I think that most Americans don't ever have a chance to see that kind of thing unless they live in a city like Chicago, which has great libraries and museums. So I think it would be maybe a wonderful thing for people to get to see those things and to be reminded of what it is that made this country a great country.
Do you think the Confederate statues need to come down?
And I was torn about this for a while, thinking, well, maybe we could contextualize them. We could have, there was a controversy at the University of Mississippi a couple of years ago over plaque and the historical information on the plaque beneath the monument. So that can become a big fight in itself. And so many of these monuments are in public space, in important public space, like in front of courthouses, which I think the message there is pretty clear.
In the Capitol.
In the Capitol, they're all over the place in public spaces, and I think they should come out of those public spaces. And I don't think that it is disrespectful to those people, some of whom aren't really deserving of much respect. And I also don't think this means that we then have to go after, Thomas Jefferson and, Calhoun and George Washington. I don't think that we have to do that in order to move the monuments who took up arms against their nation.
Dr. Jane Daly, as we bring this to a close, I just wanted to say one last thing, and I think I said this earlier, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this as a professor of history. I am not aware of any country in the world that had a civil war, and then after that civil war, the losing side got to erect monuments throughout that country of the generals and the individuals who lost. And so to me, for the United States to be, and again, this is, I guess, a dichotomy of living in a free society that has a First Amendment, but
right.
But to me, for the very fact that the losing side it got to erect monuments to the people who led the Confederacy, and that those still around over 150 years or 150 years later, they're plus or minus, that I just can't wrap my mind around the logic or the illogic of that. I mean, we're talking about people who committed treason and they lost, and now we're still arguing about this. And then we had the added variable of having a morally ambiguous president who then throws gasoline on the fire of this argument.
Yeah, I don't think there's any ambiguity about him, actually.
Not after Tuesday. Well, we thank you so much for being on today. Time is against us, so we do have to bring this to a close.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. If you could let our listeners know where they can find you or follow you on social media.
I will.
Oh, you tell them now.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you can find me on social media. Oh, I just joined Twitter. I think my name is JDaily12.
Okay.
12. But you can also always find me on Facebook. It's just my regular name there, I believe, Jane Daly.
All right. Excellent. We thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you remain a friend of the show.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
As we promised, we are bringing the heat today. And speaking of that, it's hot as hell in here.
all this equipment in here, man. You can't help
That's all right. I can still think and I can still talk. So it's good to go. That actually just warms up my vocal cords. So we're good. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we will be joined by Jennifer Lowenstein to discuss the relationship between the Trump administration and the Jewish community. Thank you for watching and listening to Humanity in the Headlines. We'll be right back. We are back on Humanity in the Headlines. Again, I am Atiba Buchanan, flanked by my good friend. And we're about to close out the show. So, but before we do, we cannot do so without having this conversation. This kind of came, listening to the transformation of Trump, to watch him go from making weak, tepid, ambiguous statements, very general statements concerning condemning white supremacy and bigotry, to specifically almost supporting them
Right.
on Tuesday. And to watch that transformation, and to see because again, when he initially spoke, it was a very flat type of affect. He was reading from a teleprompter. It was very scripted. And then on the next press conference, he was very animated. He was very impassioned about what he was speaking about when it came to him waiting until he got all the facts, which is that's a hit. And two, being able to assess blame to both sides. Again, we saw not just what he said, but how he said it.
Right.
And you got a chance to kind of see where his allegiances lied.
Right.
But as I saw that as an African American, it spoke to me one way. But then I thought about his Jewish son-in-law, and I'm like, what is this conversation going to be like?
Right.
Because he's supporting neo-Nazis. So that there has to be some context here and some nuance here that perhaps I'm not understanding. And to help us understand this better today is Miss Jennifer Lowenstein. Let me pull up your credentials here, your vast credentials. She is the senior lecturer in Middle Eastern Studies and English at Penn State College of the Liberal Arts. How are you, Miss Lowenstein?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we thank you for joining us today. You were on our previous platform called We Hear Ya some time ago. I forget the topic we had. I just know that we had an amazing conversation with you. So we've always kept your information handy. So we thank you for being available today.
Something about the Middle East.
It was. But today we want to bring it to our U.S. shores here. And I would like to ask you, what were your initial thoughts when you saw the president make his comments about the events in Charlottesville?
Oh, I was nauseated. I mean, that was my first initial reaction. My thoughts were that it was completely in line, I think, Trump stands for. It was no surprise at all. What I thought after that was that in a day or so, he would be coming out with a statement that was much stronger and against white supremacy and neo-Nazis, and that he would do so because somebody in the White House was saying, hey, you'd better get your act together and say this. So he did, and then a day after that or 2 days after that went back to his original stance, which is that there are some really nice guys in the white supremacists.
Really fine people, I think is what he called them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he's really isn't really fair because he's being true to himself. I mean, he's showing us the real Donald Trump. He's not trying to hide himself, except when he came out with a very scripted apology, or not apology, but condemnation. The real Trump is a white supremacist, racist bigot. And I think the people around him in his cabinet and in his administration reflect this to a great extent. And it's no surprise that this march in Charlottesville took place during his short tenure so far. I expect to see more of it.
Ms. Lowenstein, this is David Seaton again. Thank you for coming on today. Whenever I hear, and again, maybe you can kind of, and I know this is going to be a big question, but if you could kind of in a very succinct way, because when I hear the protesters out there saying Jews will not replace us, there's always, when you talk about Nazis or neo-Nazis, or when you talk about white supremacists in general, there's usually this undercurrent of a theme of a hatred of Jews or a disparaging of Jews. Where does that come from in the whole Nazi kind of the Nazi ethos?
Well, I think the better question, which is related, isn't so much of where this came from, because anti-Semitism has existed for a millennia at least, probably much longer, and well, definitely much longer. And it has lots of different roots, lots of different sources. what is important today is that, or what is very disturbing today is that you can have protesters or ralliers at a march like this saying things like the Jews will not take over the country or whatever it is they're saying, and at the same time have senior people in Israel failing to condemn this, and in fact, in many cases, standing alongside Trump,
Right.
and saying that this is perfectly okay, or behaving as though this is perfectly acceptable. Now, what I think is really important for people to understand, first of all, these people like Netanyahu don't represent all Jews. Many Jews are very, they were repulsed by what happened.
Right.
But the fact is that within the establishment, and certainly in the Israeli government, and in major Jewish organizations in this country, right-wing organizations, once again, we have to give them a lot of credit for being honest. These people, those who support Trump and the white supremacists like Ron Dermer, Israel's U.S., or David Freeman, our U.S. ambassador to Israel, a number of other people, these people are telling us the truth. Basically, they are openly admitting their own racism, in my view. And that is because Israel itself is a profoundly racist state. And in that sense, Jews who are opposing this rally ought to be confronting themselves in the mirror and asking themselves, why am I against neo-Nazism, white supremacism, phenomena similar to this, but while at the same time I support Israel? They really should be asking themselves this question, because supporters of Israel, even left-wing supporters of Israel, in many cases, I would say in the majority of cases, are at least minimally racist. And that's a compliment, because I think there's a deep-seated racism within Israel and Israeli society, and it has been pointed out by many people, and it is vigorously denied here and in Israel. But it's there. It's there. It goes to the core of the society, and it's very scary.
You watch what's going on between Israel and Palestine. There certainly seems to be something within the Israeli culture that is, at the very least, anti-Arab, at the most, to use your word, racist.
Oh, I mean, I don't even think racism is strong enough. The kind of society that Israel has become is Jewish supremacist. It's racist at the very least. Its policies, if you can even call them policies, are akin to war crimes in the occupied territories, in the Palestinian occupied territories, and even within Israel, in the state of Israel, Arabs are treated as second, if not third-class citizens, and that is completely acceptable to the Israeli white establishment. It's acceptable, and if you were to really dig around and pry, and when talking to many people, you'd find out that their core beliefs are, in fact, that white Jews, especially, because there are so-called Oriental Jews, are superior, that Israel should be a racially pure state, a Jewish-only state, and that minorities are only up to a point welcome. Christians are sort of acceptable. Muslims, forget about it. And Arabs, of course, are the worst of all, because they're Arab and Muslim usually.
And I'm sorry. No, and I was going to say, I guess that's kind of what Atiba was talking about when he brought this segment up, is because it gets so complicated. You've got Israelis who hate Arabs, but then you've got these neo-Nazis in this country that are speaking out against Israelis or speaking out against Jews who are from Israel, and then you've got a president who is endorsing or at the very least, like I said, being morally ambiguous about speaking out against the neo-Nazis here, while when you talk about the international realm, the United States and the Trump administration are pretending to be very good friends of Israel. So it's so complicated when you start talking about the government connections and then the cultural connections or disconnections. There's so much going on between the United States and Israel right now.
Well, yes, and a lot of it is extremely political. Some of it is, I don't know what you'd call it, is social, is personal. But a lot of it is political. Just look at Steve Bannon, who was just outed from the administration. Steve Bannon is, he's now an editor of Breitbart News. He's as any person I know, and yet he is considered a strong ally of Israel.
So when you say that, then that a lot of it is political, what is it then that Israel hopes to gain from a tight relationship from a Trump administration that they would let this type of inaction go by unchecked?
Hesitant, in my view, the political leadership of Israel is hesitant to come all out and condemn Trump and the white supremacist people who support him, because they know, Netanyahu and his ilk know full well that Israel also wants to be a white Jewish supremacist nation, the same way Bannon and Trump and many other people want to be a white Christian supremacist nation. And that's a fact. They are kindred spirits. Some are Jewish, some are Christian, and they support each other because they have the same or similar political goals.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, Professor Lowenstein, but because time is against us again. But we thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your articulation and perspective. If you could let our listeners know where they could maybe follow you on Twitter or online.
You know what? I'm just getting a Twitter account. Online, I usually write for Counterpunch, and sooner or later, I'm going to have my own blog. So
excellent.
As good as I can say.
Well,
thanks very much for inviting me on your show.
Yeah, we thank you for being available today, and again for your insight. You were great. So please remain a friend of the show. We'll be in touch in the future.
Yes.
All right, great. Have a great day, Professor. Thank you so much for listening to Humanity in the Headlines today. Again, we promised to bring you the heat, and I think we did, Dave. Don't you think so?
I believe so. I believe we definitely did.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone have a phenomenal weekend. We're going to try and bring the same level of heat and excellence next week. Again, Earl Winfrey, enjoy your birthday. We want to thank Mr. Breon Jones for producing a wonderful show. Dave, go ahead with your
No, I was just going to say happy birthday to Big Earl over there. That's all.
Absolutely. We'll be back next week. Thank you for listening to Humanity in the Headlines. Take care, everybody.